Hi, I'm Dr. Joseph Wittering, and I'm making this introduction for this video because today Andrew is talking about PSSD, but towards the end of the interview, we actually have quite a long discussion about different experimental treatments for PSSD. All of these things are anecdotes; they're not from clinical trials. You know, it's very try at your own risk, but I think it brings a really welcome and new perspective because when you're suffering from a condition like this, why not try things if they're reasonably safe? So, if you're interested in hearing about some of the treatments he's tried and the other things out there, I'd recommend skipping towards the end of the video. And I hope you enjoy the interview. Hi, I'm Dr. Joseph Wittering. It is my pleasure to welcome Andrew to the interview today. He is suffering from PSSD, and I think it's really important to get these stories out there. And so, without going into too much more, Andrew, I want you to just go ahead and just tell us what happened to you.
Yeah. So my experience with PSSD started back in late 2019, early 2020, which is kind of an especially unfortunate time to develop this condition because that was also around the time the pandemic hit.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so around that time, I was in my second year of grad school. I'm currently in a PhD program. I'm in my fifth year now, so hopefully just another year or two left before I graduate.
And
And
what are you studying?
I'm studying molecular biology.
Okay. Yeah.
So I wish I could say I was like uniquely placed to comment on this particular condition because it seems to involve neurochemistry, but unfortunately, I study a completely different area of molecular biology, so I don't have
Okay.
any specialties. Um, and Yeah, and so I was going through kind of a stressful period. It was my second year of my PhD. I was getting ready for my qualifying exam. I was working on a grant proposal at the time, and I was also teaching a class. My program requires that I teach 2 semesters of undergrad molecular bio courses. And I had always had some degree of anxiety and depressive symptoms, for most of my life prior to that point, going way back to like, middle school and high school. I had a lot of social anxiety, especially, that was kind of an issue for me up to that point. And I think the combination of, teaching, which was something I didn't really feel too comfortable with, getting up in front of a classroom of people and talking and, having to have enough of a command of the subject to be able to teach people, that sort of thing. As well as just the stress of the other stuff going on at the time, really exacerbated my anxiety symptoms.
Hmm.
And so it got so bad at one point that I started having insomnia, really bad insomnia, to the point where I actually had an episode where I didn't sleep for multiple days on end. I think by the end of the episode, it was like 9 days without sleep.
My
Um,
God. Yeah.
yeah, I
Mm.
don't, my memory of the time is not super clear. So, I mean, it's possible that I might have like slept a little bit during that time, had like micro sleeps or something. But um, as far as I can recall, it was like 9 days of complete sleeplessness,
And
which
if I may ask, when you were kind of going through this, were you on were you on anything else? Were you on other medications? Were you on caffeine? Were you dipping? Were you chewing tobacco? Was there anything kind of else going on?
no,
Yeah. Hmm.
no, I wasn't on any medication at the time. I mean, I drank coffee, pretty regularly, not like an unusual amount, like 1 cup per day.
Okay.
Um, when I was going through the insomnia episode, I was put on a variety of sleep aids, over the course of that 9 day period. Every
Hmm.
day I'd be checking into the health center and being like, yo, I haven't slept, for a day or two. What can you give me? And so they tried a variety of things, melatonin, let's see,
Trazodone, I guess. Yeah.
trazodone. Later on, at some point, I tried Ambien. That didn't help. Anyway, so yeah, so it eventually got so bad that I just, insisted, it's like, look, this is getting really bad. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I need to be checked into a hospital. And it took some convincing at the health center, but eventually they took me to a hospital. I actually was checked into a psych ward for a couple nights. And again, I don't recall exactly how things went down. I was put on a couple of sedatives while I was there. I don't recall what they were, which managed to get me to sleep. And then after I was checked out, I was prescribed sertraline or Zoloft, an SSRI, to help manage my anxiety symptoms. And that's kind of when the whole sort of PSSD situation started. I mean, so
Just quickly, I just want to ask, usually when people hear, I didn't sleep for several days, the first thing they think of is, bipolar disorder. Were you having mood changes as well, or was it just like isolated to sleep and you were still kind of the same Andrew?
yeah, it was really
Yeah.
just
Okay.
it was sleep and just sort of rampant anxiety.
Okay.
Sort of, it was kind of like the snowball effect where I started getting nervous about the fact that I wasn't sleeping and wondering what was going to happen. Was I going to be able to sleep the next night? And my anxiety just kept ramping up and making the situation worse. But I didn't have any sort of mood or personality changes.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hallucinate even after like a week of no sleep. I felt pretty normal aside from being extremely exhausted, kind of panicky and anxious, and yeah, just feeling really tired.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So yeah. So it sounds like you left not on any sedatives, but that they thought the cause of all of this was anxiety, and so they put you on Zoloft.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. And yeah, and so I should stress that prior to all of this happening, I never had any sort of sexual dysfunction symptoms to speak of. None of the sort of emotional blunting or other symptoms that are associated with PSSD. But as soon as I started Zoloft, I started experiencing, sort of the host of usual unpleasant side effects, where I noticed it was hard for me to get an erection. I felt sort of like emotionally blunted. It was kind of hard for me to think, hard for me to remember things. Uh, my sort of mood and like overall energy level kind of like shifted around a bit, the first couple of weeks on the medication as I was adjusting, but um, the sexual dysfunction was kind of a through line during that entire period. Um, and I stayed on Zoloft for about 6 months, if I remember correctly, after after the insomnia episode and after I got started on it.
Let me ask
And
you this: that 6 month period of time, was it therapeutic? I mean, was it helpful? Did it bring the anxiety down? I know you said you were having some cognitive, you're feeling off kind of cognitively, but for that period, was it a helpful drug for you?
yeah, it actually did its
Yeah.
job pretty well for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
It really managed my anxiety. Although I think that was kind of a side effect, or that was kind of a product of the overall sort of emotional blunting, just the fact that I
That's
didn't
what they
respond.
do. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that I didn't
Yeah.
respond to anything as strongly as I did before. I do recall, again, I think this was when I was first adjusting to the medication, that there was a period of like a week or so, and I wish I could remember like what the dosage was or all that, but I unfortunately don't. When I experienced this, when I felt really sort of euphoric and like really happy, like unusually happy for a period of several days.
Mhm.
So that was interesting and kind of pleasant at the time, I suppose. Um, but despite that, and despite the fact that I was managing my anxiety pretty well, um, the sexual dysfunction was a bummer at the time. I wasn't dating at the time. I wasn't seeing anyone, but I was like, okay, this could be an issue if I stay on this medication. Um, and I could tell that it was messing me up cognitively a little bit. It was hard to remember things, harder to pay attention in class, that sort of thing. Um, and so like I said, after about 6 months, I decided to get off the medication, and I tapered off. I again don't recall exactly how long the taper was. Um, I seem to remember that it was in fairly small increments of the drug. I was cutting the tablets into like quarters. Um, and Yeah, and so so for a period of several weeks, I tapered off, and the various sort of unpleasant side effects that I experienced on Zoloft never went away. The sexual dysfunction, cognitive dysfunction, emotional blunting, all have persisted with me in some form, I would say, up until now.
A couple questions. So the first thing is, why did you decide to come off?
I mean, the main reason was the sexual dysfunction, to be honest. I mean, it
Okay.
was distressing enough that, I was like, this is, I don't know how I'm going to be able to date or have a relationship, if I'm on Zoloft for perpetuity.
And
Um,
and I guess could you give us a sense of like how bad was it when you were on the medication? Because I've heard, there's a wide range of things. Some people aren't, it's like every single ounce of focus is needed to, get an erection. They would see someone attractive and, they wouldn't become aroused anymore. I've heard, of people who, they may be, by themselves watching pornographic material and they're not even able to, they're barely able to kind of bring themselves to an erection. It's just, it's so muted. It's like 5% of like kind of where it was before. Was it severe for you when you were on the medication, or was it just kind of like, I don't know, 60% of what it used to be, but that was enough for you to say like, hey, like something is really wrong about this?
it was pretty severe. Sorry, the siren going by.
That's okay.
Um, yeah, everything you just described pretty much applied to my situation.
Hmm.
When I tried to masturbate, it was hard to get an erection, hard to keep one. It did require pretty much constant focus.
Hmm.
The overall, the sensitivity of my genitals was reduced. It took a lot more sort of work to have an orgasm. Um, I didn't have as much responsiveness to like erotic material, pornography,
Hmm.
while I was trying to masturbate. Um, yeah, and that was all very evident, like from pretty much day one of starting Zoloft, and to a the symptoms have changed a bit, like in the time since stopping, and I can get into that later if you want. But yeah, I'd say that's more or
No,
less the now.
yeah, well, let's go to that. Another thing that I've heard from many people is that when they came off the medication, things actually worsened for them. Did things worsen for you, or were they just like the same when you discontinued?
Um, I wouldn't say they got any worse. I'd say things persisted more or less unchanged for a while after stopping the medication. And in the time since, it's been like 3.5 years now. Um, I would say the character of my symptoms has changed a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wouldn't say it got dramatically worse after stopping.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about that. What's changed over the last three and a half years?
Yeah. So one thing I should start with before I go into that is, so after stopping Zoloft, I did try a number of other psychiatric medications to manage my anxiety. My anxiety kind of came back a bit when I stopped Zoloft,
Sure.
and I was having some trouble with insomnia again when I got off the Zoloft. And so for that reason, I was prescribed trazodone for about a year after stopping, which didn't make any difference that I could detect my sexual symptoms.
Hmm.
Um, my mood and sort of other issues sort of changed a little bit, my anxiety symptoms and whatnot. Um, but the through line of like the difficulty having an orgasm, difficulty getting an erection, all that persisted. And then after a year on trazodone, I tapered off that and I tried Wellbutrin because I had been told and I had read online that Wellbutrin has been effective in people who are having sexual dysfunction either on SSRI or after stopping.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I decided to give that a try. That improved my mood quite a bit. It made me more sociable, more outgoing. I would say a bit happier overall. But again, the sexual dysfunction symptoms, stuck around, unfortunately. But yeah, I would say so throughout that entire period, in terms of like, how hard it was to get an erection. That changed a bit from time to time. Um, Sometimes over the course of a week, I would notice that on certain days it was easier to get an erection than it was the day
Hmm.
before. Um, I noticed there were periods of times where the sensitivity in my genitals was greater than it had been, like say in a past week, or orgasms felt better or more
Hmm.
intense than they were before. All that has sort of fluctuated over the last couple of years,
Okay.
and there's no clear correlation that I could detect between like what medication I was on.
And are you on other medications currently, or have you been off all medications? And if so, for how long? Yeah.
Yeah. I've been off any psychiatric medications for, oh boy, I would say fall of last year, I think is when I finally tapered off Wellbutrin.
Okay.
Um, yeah, in the time since, yeah, I've mostly just been taking a variety of, sort of over the counter things to try and potentially address my PSSD symptoms, which I can get to that again later. Maybe I'll save that for later on down the line.
Yeah. Okay. And did are you otherwise healthy? Like no, blood, heart problems or anything else going on?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for the most part, I would say I have a pretty clean bill of health. I'm
Hmm.
mildly overweight, and I have been for a long time. But I'm not morbidly obese.
Hmm.
I have high cholesterol. That's been a pretty consistent result of my blood work for the last few years. Um, I've had my testosterone levels checked multiple times over the last couple of years. They've always come up within the normal range, although I guess there's kind of a broad range of what's considered normal for an
Yeah.
adult male. My levels are, if I remember correctly, like around 417 nanograms per deciliter. So like lower middle average, I guess.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, yeah, and I've had like no other abnormal test results when I've had my blood drawn of any kind.
And when did you realize that you had PSSD? What was that process like for you, discovering kind of what had happened?
Yeah, I think it was about maybe maybe a year or so after stopping Zoloft that I kind of internalized like, okay, this seems to be kind of a long-term entrenched problem. Because up until that point, I thought to myself, it's like, oh, I stopped medication in the last year. Sometimes withdrawal can take a while. It can take 6 months to a year for things to normalize. Um, but so I kind of like held out hope that it's like, oh, things will just get better on their own. But after about a year, I kind of it sort of sank in. It's like, okay, I think I probably have PSSD. Which I had been aware of I had been aware of PSSD like prior to that realization. Like I actually was told about it, or it had been mentioned to me as a possible consequence of taking the drug when it was first prescribed to me. But I was told it was very rare. So
Okay, so you're the person who prescribed it to you in the hospital warned you about it.
yeah, I forget if I brought it up or if they brought it up unprompted, but they did mention that there was a very small chance of persistent sexual dysfunction or other side effects after stopping. But
Now
they said it was
that
rare, you know.
sure, sure. I mean, that's really unique though, because I mean, most of the people I talk to, that is not something that's even mentioned when they started. Okay. Um, and okay, so why don't you go ahead and so one of the most prominent symptoms of PSSD are, I guess, what folks like David Healy consider the hallmark symptom. It's genital anesthesia. It's the loss of, I guess, erogenous sensation in that region. Has that been a consistent symptom for you this whole time? Feeling like your privates. They don't doesn't feel like your privates. It kind of feels like your arm or your elbow or something that doesn't have that same sensory pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I wouldn't say it's as bad as I've heard in some cases where, like you said, the tip of my penis feels like the back of my hand.
Hmm.
It's not quite that bad, but there's definitely a pretty reduced level of sensitivity versus how it used to be. It's honestly been kind of subtle.
Hmm.
It wasn't obvious to me for a while, which seems kind of surprising, but you know, yeah, I think I only really realized recently, when I thought back, it's like, okay, how did things feel like, 4 years ago before all this started? Um, and I think about how it feels now. It's like, yeah, it's definitely not as sensitive as it used to
Okay.
be.
And do you feel like now 3.5 years later, you still have the emotional blunting that you had when you were on Zoloft?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's as bad as
Yeah.
when I was on the drug, but there's definitely a degree of emotional blunting that I still experience. And it's kind of it's kind of weird. It's kind of weird when I talk about it because it feels almost paradoxical. It's like, I'll say that I don't experience strong emotions or that, I don't enjoy things the way I used to. And even as I'm talking right now, I mean, like you can see that I can still emote. I'm
Yeah.
clearly not like completely dead inside.
Hmm.
Um, but I do definitely, I do definitely feel that, when I'm doing something that used to excite me, um, or something that I used to get a lot of pleasure out of, it doesn't quite hit me in the same way it used to. I go skiing fairly often during the season. I'm in Northern California, so we're not too far from Tahoe. And when I'm going down the slopes, I just noticed that my heart doesn't really quite race the way that it used to.
Hmm.
When I do it, I don't really get quite as much adrenaline when I go skiing. Um, when I'm doing something like watching a movie, I find that I'm not quite as emotionally impacted by stuff that's happening on screen as I might have been in the past. Even if it's like a movie that I used to really enjoy,
Hmm.
um, or it really resonated with me. Something that I've noticed in the last year, this has been a fairly recent development actually, and it's fairly troubling, is that I don't really get as much out of music as I used to.
Hmm.
Um, and I can't pinpoint exactly when this happened. I'm not sure if it's when I stopped Wellbutrin, um, or if it happened while I was still on the drug. But at some point in the last year, I just it's like a switch got flipped. It's just like I'll listen to music that I used to really enjoy and that emotionally resonated with me and made me like feel various things, and it's just become noise. Um,
Hmm.
and that is particularly kind of distressing. I mean, almost as much as like the sexual problems that I'm still having. It's like that was one of the. I was like, oh yeah, well at least I can enjoy things like that. But yeah, something seems to have happened in, like I said, the last year,
Okay.
where my responsiveness to music has decreased.
Um, I have heard that a lot before. And I guess the next thing I'd be interested in asking you about is, um, what is it? Do you feel like you still have anxiety at the level that you used to have before, or has it kind of knocked that out of you? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the few. I don't want to say it's one of the upsides of this condition for me, but yeah, I would say I don't really have much anxiety, or really most of the time, like any anxiety, whether it's related to my work,
Hmm.
or about my life circumstances in general, um, or around people. Like I said, I used to have a lot of social anxiety, and I'd feel uncomfortable talking to people. That's mostly gone away.
Wow.
Um, I, I have to admit, I felt a little bit nervous, when I was getting ready for this interview, and I
Oh,
think I
yeah.
still have a little bit of the stage fright jitters. Um, but aside from things like that, yeah, most of like the constant sort of like ruminating and just sort of anxious thoughts I used to have, those have pretty much gone away. And I also wouldn't say I feel particularly depressed either. Um, and I think both of those are just kind of an outgrowth of the fact that I just don't feel emotions in general as strongly as I used to. Things just don't impact me the way they used to. And so I don't get hit as hard by things that used to distress me.
And, you know, how does something like that play out in your interpersonal relationships and things like that? Oftentimes, I don't know, emotion, noticing things, getting upset, these are all things that play out in relationships. Have you noticed that this has affected close relationships at all?
Yeah, I don't think I don't think it's outwardly obvious to a lot of people that I feel
Hmm.
different.
Hmm.
I think when I'm hanging with a bunch of my friends, I'm not usually talking about you know heavily emotionally charged stuff with them unless it's
Hmm.
special circumstances. So I feel like yeah, under most circumstances, probably not super obvious that I'm feeling some degree of emotional blunting. There are times when like I'll be hanging out with my friends and like they'll be really animated or excited about something that happened.
Hmm.
Um, again, maybe we just got back from a movie and we're talking about the movie we saw, and I feel like I can't really get on their level, emotionally. Where I feel like whatever just happened isn't impacting me, and I can't quite, share in their enthusiasm. And that, again, I don't know how often that's apparent to them or to other people in general, but it bothers me quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it probably isn't. I mean, one of the things about PSSD is you really can't tell if someone has it. And I've spoken to some people who tell me that, I'm dead inside. And then, when you're talking to them, they may seem a little flat, but you could just say, oh, maybe they're just like a little tired today. You don't, it doesn't, the way they feel inside doesn't really translate into how they come across. And also because people with PSSD, cognitively, they come across as completely together, oftentimes very articulate and fully aware of everything going on.
yeah, yeah. I
Hmm.
mean, I think I think it's quite subtle. A lot of the effects, or a lot of the symptoms, and I think it's probably one of those things where because you're so in tune with how your own internal emotional state and how you feel on a day-to-day basis, that when there's a disruption to that or when there's a change to that, you notice it pretty strongly. But you know, yeah, to other
Hmm.
people, I think it's probably a lot more subtle. Um, yeah,
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is, some of the other chaps that I've been talking to lately. I mean, they talk about, I guess, their romantic life, and how it's kind of put it on hold, or sometimes not even, I guess having, understandable self-esteem problems about it. Wondering, um, how how's this going to translate into a romance if I can't offer this part of it to the other person. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about, I mean, how you've been dealing with the effect of PSSD with your romantic life.
yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, in some ways, PSSD hasn't actually made that much of a difference in my romantic life because I didn't really have too much of a dating life before I
Hmm.
got hit with this. Um, throughout my like teens and early 20s, like I said, had a lot of anxiety problems. I wasn't very confident. I had some self-esteem issues, and that kind of inhibited me from really having much of a dating life. Um, I did like date briefly in undergrad,
Hmm.
and had my first sexual relationship. And so I do have kind of a benchmark for how things were back then. Um, but yeah, but aside from that, yeah, I was mostly celibate in my teens and early 20s. And yeah, since developing PSSD, I've mostly, not really pursued romantic
Hmm.
relationships in any form. There was an exception last year where I was feeling a little bit better. Actually, when I started Wellbutrin, I was feeling better sort
Yeah.
of emotionally, but more upbeat and outgoing. Again, there wasn't any improvement in my sexual symptoms, but nonetheless. Um, and during that period, I did try dating a little bit, just, meeting people on dating apps, and
Sure.
going on a couple of dates. And, I did have a couple of sexual encounters during that time. And, you know, it was just, things were just not working.
Yeah. Sure.
uh, during those experiences. And I didn't really feel embarrassed about it or particularly self-conscious about it. I was pretty transparent with both the people I was with,
Hmm.
um, during that period. But these are separate occasions. I should point out. Not I wasn't dating two people at the same time.
Okay. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and but it was just so much of a hassle and so much of a problem. Like, just trying to function sexually, that I was like, okay, I need to get a handle on this problem before I can seriously think about dating again.
Sure. So that's like a good segue because I know you've tried a number of things to treat your symptoms. I was wondering if you could kind of share some of the different things that you've tried. Um, mhm.
Yeah. So, so like I said, for the first year or so, I kind of just waited and just thought I'd just wait and see, if things would get better. But when it became apparent that things weren't getting better, I decided to start experimenting with various either prescription medications or over-the-counter supplements, to see if anything made a difference. And a lot of this was informed by just my going online and going through the PSSD subreddit. There's a subreddit dedicated to PSSD. As I think you actually posted on there recently, if I
Mhm.
remember correctly.
Yep.
There's a PSSD forum. There's a number of other sort of support groups and networks that have sprung up over the last decade or so. And I would just go down the list of posts and see is like, okay, what have people tried? What's helped them? And I started with things that seemed fairly, if not safe, like fairly, reasonable to try, like Wellbutrin, which, like I said, is commonly prescribed to help people who are having sexual dysfunction when they're on an SSRI. Um, but I also tried, various over-the-counter supplements, some of which are explicitly meant to help with sexual function, like, let's see, what have I tried? Maca, I think Tribulus, most of these are just like herbal supplements. Um, horny goat weed, I think is one of them, that I've
Hmm.
tried. None of those made any appreciable difference. I should point out that I've also, taken Viagra. I saw a urologist at one point who prescribed Viagra, and that helped. That has helped on some occasions with the erectile dysfunction, but not with any of the other
Sure.
symptoms. And so I kind of continued in this vein for a while, where I would just try something for a few days to a week, see how it made me feel. Usually it was ineffective, and so I would just move on to the next thing. And then last year, let's see, I think it was around this time. Yeah, around this time last year, I came across a post on the PSSD subreddit. Uh, and this was kind of one of those like cure of the month posts where, like, somebody says like,
Yeah.
oh, hey, this thing, and it really helped me, and I think it's definitely going to help all of you guys. It's usually these posts like have some sort of like somewhat informed scientific rationale behind them, where they say, oh, like this thing acts on these
Hmm.
receptors, so on and so forth. Anyway, so there was this post that came out, that came up about a year ago, where this guy mentioned that, or described that he had been prescribed an antibiotic,
Hmm.
of all things, for an intestinal bacterial problem that he had. I think it's a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is the name, or SIBO.
Hmm.
And he said, yeah, I was diagnosed with this intestinal issue. I was put on this antibiotic, rifaximin specifically. I think he tried a couple of other things, like he was trying probiotics at the time. And he said that his symptoms cleared up in a matter of weeks. And this was sketchy in a number of ways. For one thing, I think this particular person only had been experiencing PSSD symptoms for like 6 months after stopping the SSRI, which is, not really that
Not that
long.
long. Yeah.
A lot of people seem to recover within that window spontaneously. But I thought to myself, what do I have to lose? Let's go ahead and give this a try. So I went out and I had a test done for SIBO. It's a breath test where they just measure the level of like methane and hydrogen gas on your breath because it's produced by microbes in your gut. I tested positive, which they were a little surprised by. And I was prescribed rifaximin, the same antibiotic this one person was on. And, I can't rule out the placebo effect necessarily, but over the course of a month, I felt substantially better across the board.
Wow.
Yeah, I was as shocked as yeah, I was shocked. My
So
erectile
how long did you take the drug for? The antibiotic.
about a month.
So you take it
Uh,
for a month, and are you
yeah.
taking anything else at the time? Any other probiotics?
No probiotics at the time. Just the antibiotic,
Okay.
and you know, during that period, I was actually on Wellbutrin, but I had been on it for some time at that point, and like I said, up until that point, I hadn't experienced any improvement in my symptoms. Um, but yeah, unmistakably, like over the course of a month, I started getting harder erections. I felt more energetic, more motivated, more clear-headed than I had been in a while. I think my memory improved. Um, I felt more interested in dating than I had in a while, or just sort of abstractly, and that sort of continued, sort of steadily improving over the course of the month while I was on the antibiotic. But unfortunately, I couldn't stay on it indefinitely. There are risks if you take antibiotics for too long, as I'm sure you're aware. You can have bacteria develop drug resistance. And
Sure.
so I stopped after a month, and the doctor I was seeing didn't recommend that I continued, and all the benefits I saw went away over the course of
Okay.
about a week after stopping.
And since that time, have you done a retest at all, or has that been something that?
I think, if I remember correctly, a month or so later, I found another doctor who was willing to let me try that same antibiotic for about a week, and I I don't really recall if that made any difference.
Okay. Have you heard of anyone else trying this apart from you and this first guy?
Yeah, I mean, if you go on the subreddit, you'll find a number of people who tested for this condition, SIBO, and came up with a positive result. Uh, Multiple people have said that they tried rifaximin after getting SIBO and that their symptoms improved to some degree. Some people say their symptoms didn't improve. Um, Other people have tried different antibiotics and said they got either positive or no results while taking it. Uh, yeah, that's one of the maddening things about this problem is that some people seem to be helped by just seemingly random things, and then other people try it and it either doesn't help or it does help a bit, or in some cases people get worse,
Yeah.
apparently.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you was when you did that breath test, and prior to getting on the antibiotic, were you having any GI problems? Were you having any bloating or constipation or, diarrhea or just like kind of, were you feeling off like in your gut at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was something I hadn't even really thought about up until that point, but the entire time that I was on Zoloft, going forward to getting off, and just the following few years, I'd been experiencing pretty much constant like GI problems. I was just always either having, loose stools or diarrhea, or I was constipated intermittently. I don't think I had what would be considered like a normal, healthy bowel movement for years.
Hmm.
Um, and and that was something I just never really thought about. Really, I mean, it was unpleasant, but it wasn't so distressing, or it wasn't painful, so I didn't like get it checked out. I just thought, I'm in grad school. I'm stressed out. I'm having some sort of weird medical issues. This is probably just a part of that.
And did this precede getting on the Zoloft, or was this something that happened after getting on the Zoloft and coming off it, the GI stuff?
It got pretty distinctly worse and more persistent after getting on
Okay.
Zoloft. I would say before that, I would intermittently have GI issues, but it was pretty much a constant fact of life, like after Zoloft.
And have you tried any dietary modifications, gluten-free, dairy-free, any of that kind of uh, any of that stuff before?
I did try I think it's called a low FODMAP diet, FODMAP. I forget exactly what it stands for. While I was in the second half of the trial with the rifaximin, and that's a diet that's recommended for people who are trying to get rid of SIBO. It sort of like starves the bacteria, I guess, involved. Um, it's basically like a low sugar, low carb, low gluten diet. Um, and again, it's hard for me to say really, and my recollection is a little foggy. But I think that might have improved my symptoms a bit when I took that additional measure. But it's really hard to say. And I've tried that approach like since stopping the antibiotic and haven't really had any success.
Okay. Um, and okay, so now you're just back on to like a kind of a more normal diet, no restrictions or anything like that. Okay.
Yeah.
And from being in the community, what do you see out there about people who change their diets? I mean, is that also kind of like hit and miss? Some people say it helps, some people does nothing, other people they go worse. I mean, what could you share about that?
Yeah, it's definitely hit and miss. As with just about every treatment strategy that people have proposed and tried online, there are some people who say that they started eating clean, or they went vegetarian, or followed a low FODMAP diet or some other restrictive diet, and they say that they got better. Um, Other people say they tried those approaches and it didn't work. Um, there are a number of people online, on the subreddit and on the forum, who say that they've tried non-antibiotic approaches to address a potential bacterial problem in their gut. Things like peppermint oil, garlic oil, various plant-based oil supplements, which are supposed to have antimicrobial properties. Some people say that those help. There have been
Hmm.
reports that trying a regimen of those things have helped with their PSSD symptoms. Some people say that they're cured after trying those things. I've tried those particular oil supplements, independently of the antibiotics, and they didn't seem to make any difference to me.
Hmm.
And yeah, so and I think that's experience has also been reported by other people on these various online forums. So yeah, it's like everything else. It's very hit or miss.
Okay. And any other treatments out there that, when at least when you're in the communities, they seem to be, have a larger group of people saying that they're helpful. I mean, which things stand out to you?
Yeah. Well, the main thing. So the main strategy that has apparently helped probably the largest number of people online has been some sort of hormonal based approach, which I was very, I had known about this for a while since looking into PSSD and potential therapeutic strategies. I was very hesitant to try anything that messed with my hormones for fairly obvious reasons. There's a lot of horror stories out there about people's hormone production getting shut off after, for example, testosterone injections, that sort of thing, becoming infertile for life. And, so I was very unwilling to risk anything in that sort of sphere. But nonetheless, there are a few dozen reports, I think, that I've come across where people say that they've tried some manner of hormonal-based approach, either actually just injecting testosterone, exogenous testosterone, or some other approach like taking the drug Clomid, which is normally prescribed for helping fertility in women, but can also raise testosterone and in some cases estrogen in men. I think actually fairly recently there was a post. It was again another one of these sort of like cure of the month posts, which was a little sketchy and like had a lot of sort of hyperbolic claims and things like that, where someone claimed that they were cured by doing a testosterone cycle and then also supplementing with estrogen. This was a male individual, if I understood correctly, who said that the estrogen supplementation in particular helped their symptoms. And, they made this whole sort of elaborate theory based on this experience, which I can't really comment on. Anyway, so that, after all this other stuff, I tried and had moderate success. I should point out actually before I launch into the next topic, there was one other supplement I tried which helped in the last couple of months, and that's this herbal supplement called Fourskull. It's from a plant called Coleus forskolii, I think is the scientific name. The supplement is recorded as having a number of therapeutic properties. It can affect dopamine signaling in the brain, according to some sources. There's some peer-reviewed literature on this. It apparently boosts testosterone as one of the recorded effects.
Okay.
And so I tried that about a month ago, and that actually probably helped me more, I would say, than anything else I've tried at this point.
More so than the antibiotics?
More so than the antibiotics. Well, in certain regards. I would say as far as my sexual dysfunction symptoms, those improved to a more dramatic degree than I had seen up until that point. It was a lot easier to get an erection. My erections were harder than they had been for years up until that point. I felt like my libido had come back to a degree. My orgasms were stronger than they had been. It was honestly pretty wild. I mean, I made a post on the subreddit about a week into the trial. I was like, hey guys, you should all, I guess I became one of those people.
Cure of the month.
Yeah,
the cure of the month guy. Yeah.
I became one of those people, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I was like, hey guys, you really should try this. It's doing wonders. I think it also improved my mood quite a bit because I think I was a lot more excitable and kind of euphoric at the time. Or maybe not euphoric, but just excited. So things were great for about a week, but then it sort of petered out after that. I just been taking a steady, the same dose every day for about a week. And, I just kept going after that. And the benefits that I noticed just slowly faded over a period of several days. But
I was going to say, did you up the dose? So do you think you were becoming dependent on the effect, or maybe, I don't know, maybe your liver was like metabolizing the drug out faster or something like that?
I didn't increase the dose. I actually forget what the dosage was. I think it was like 2.5 grams. I'm honestly not sure off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. It was double what the recommended dose was on the bottle that I had purchased. I thought that maybe, I thought that maybe I was like taking too much or that my body had built up a tolerance to it. And so I decided to like take a break from it for about a week and then give it another shot at like the regular dose. And I had another week-long trial at the sort of recommended dose, and there were moderate improvements, but not as dramatic as before.
That's really interesting. And did you hear about this from someone else on the forum? Hey, you guys, try Fourskull. And how did you stumble across that?
I honestly don't even remember. It was just I was just going down the list of things that people had tried, going down the list of posts on Reddit and the forum, and I think I just saw Fourskull in somewhere, and I was like, oh hey, that's an herbal supplement I haven't tried yet. Let's give that one a shot. And
Mhm.
I wasn't really expecting anything, but yeah, like I said, the results were fairly dramatic. But this, despite the fact that it didn't end up helping in the long run, it got me thinking that maybe my problem was hormonal because, like I said, one of the apparent effects of Fourskull, and if you go into the peer-reviewed literature that exists on this particular subject, is that it raises testosterone through some mechanism. And so I thought, oh well, maybe my problem is something to do with my hormones, and so that led me to seek out a different urologist than the one I had been seeing previously. I went through my symptoms. They were quite a bit more receptive than the previous one I had talked to. They said they'd kind of heard about this problem before, um, and they agreed to let me try clomiphene, which is that medication that I mentioned earlier, which
Mhm.
acts to raise testosterone and also estrogen.
Mhm.
And so I've actually been on a trial of that for about 3 weeks now. And
Tell me about it.
so far, nothing really to report, honestly.
Okay.
I would say I honestly haven't really noticed many effects. I think I'm a lot more tired in the mornings than I was before starting, but nothing in the realm of my PSSD has changed.
Mhm. Um, okay. Do people who have PSSD, have they managed to get physicians to prescribe them just straight tea?
I think there are a number of people online who say they found doctors who have, yeah, allowed them to take that approach. And the guy that I'm seeing mentioned that if this doesn't work, the Clomid approach, that was an option that I could look into. There are other urologists, that I've talked to who were unwilling to try that approach because they look at my levels. They say, "Oh, your levels are normal. We don't recommend." Exogenous testosterone unless your levels are, below average or outside the normal range. I think there are also, I can't confirm this, but it's my impression that there are a number of people online who have, just gotten
Required
testosterone.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. through some other means, and just
Hmm.
are basically shooting up at home, which, I can't recommend as a good idea, obviously.
Hmm.
um, which I was unwilling to try myself.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to do anything that risky, I want to do it with a doctor's supervision.
Yeah, makes sense. And so the plan with the clomiphene, is it a one dose kind of thing, or will you kind of go up on the dose, you know, fairly soon if you don't notice any change, just to see kind of how you do at the higher level?
I'm not really sure what the plan is at this point. I'm taking, let's see, 25 milligrams per day, and have been for about 3 weeks. The plan is to draw my blood at the end of the month-long trial, and see if my testosterone levels have changed. If not, I'm not sure if the plan is to increase the dose of Clomid or move on to testosterone therapy.
Okay,
Um, there might be other options that I'm not aware of, but yeah.
sure. Okay. Well, please keep me in the loop. At the very least, send me a follow-up email and let me know how you do at the end of the Clomid, and then also if you end up getting pharmaceutical testosterone, and letting me know if that works as well. I think these anecdotes are really important, for everyone out there.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's all we really have at the moment. There's not really much peer-reviewed literature on the subject. There's a couple of sort of retrospective studies where people have looked at reports submitted to urologist offices, for example, and just looked at how many people report symptoms consistent with PSSD in conjunction with former SSRI use. There are a couple studies out there where people have tried potential treatment strategies for PSSD, but they have very small sample sizes. I think usually like an N of one, just a single patient. So those aren't really too informative or useful. So unfortunately, all we really have at the moment are anecdotes. And like I said, they're sort of all over the place. People have tried a lot of different things. Some of them kind of innocuous, like herbal supplements. Some of them a little bit more risky, like hormonal therapy. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it makes things worse, either for a temporary period or apparently indefinitely, according to the testimonies you can find. And so we're all just kind of fumbling around and comparing notes. And what we really need is focused research, to try and address this problem. And I think I'm hoping that due in no small part to people like yourself, that as people become more aware of this problem and get a better handle on what its symptoms are, maybe how common it is. I don't think it's even really established how common an issue PSSD is. There are no real solid numbers on that front. I think we'll get more people in the research sort of sphere interested in potentially addressing this problem.
I really feel like it'll end up being solved by people in the community, because you think about it, okay, yeah, so you have a clinical trial. What compound are they going to put forward to study? And I bet you that compound will come from anecdotes. Someone's just saying, this has worked for enough people, we should kind of give it a go. I mean, because I guess the other thing is, I don't even know, you pull 50 people with PSSD into a laboratory and, biopsies are taken, and then a neuropathologist looks at the findings, and hopefully there's something in there where they say, oh, let's look at this thing. I almost wonder if it's just as likely that it will just be found out just by coincidence and chance by people experimenting than some kind of neuropathological finding, pointing towards a cure. It's yeah.
Either way.
Yeah.
Either way, as long as we find something, and hopefully in the future. I think ultimately, I think it'll probably be a combination of things, because the one thing about the various sort of anecdotal results that people have mentioned is that there are some through lines. There are some sort of somewhat occasionally some kind of tenuous connections between what's worked for some number of people. The common sort of factors seem to be something to do with hormones, something to do with dopamine signaling, something to do with serotonin signaling. Obviously these are kind of broad, vague categories. I'm not an expert on it, but I mean, like, it's the list of possibilities as to what's going on isn't endless. It's kind of restricted to a fairly small list of suspects, I think. Well, maybe that's a little, maybe that's overstepping a bit. So I don't know. I have to think that for example, I'm sorry, I had a thought and I lost it a moment ago. One thing I want to point out is, like, for example, the things that in my own personal experience which have helped. So I told you my story with rifaximin. So in addition to the sort of obvious antimicrobial properties of the antibiotic, apparently it also is known to act on sort of the hormonal axis. I think I shared a paper over email when we first corresponded, where it was found that it stimulates the release of this one thyroid hormone, and so which on the one hand kind of confuses things a little bit because it just goes to show that these various treatments that people have tried that help in some cases, they can have a variety of different mechanisms or a variety of different sort of effects, some of which are not obvious.
That is
Uh,
really interesting. Yeah, here I am thinking the antibiotic is helping because of, it's, killing the gut, bacteria, and maybe there's less GI irritation, which is kind of, maybe lessening the confusing signals that are going up to the brain, and that's helping. But like you said, there could be a direct hormonal effect, that's a completely, different pathway.
yeah,
Um, mhm.
yeah, and I mean, and there are sort of similar kind of like multivalent interactions that apply with a lot of things people have tried, and yeah. On the one hand, it can be hard to tease out what's really going on when people get better when they try some of these random things. But on the other hand, like I said, there are some commonalities and through lines. Hormones, dopamine, serotonin. You know, so I think hopefully any successful treatment approach will be sort of a mixture of you know trying things or testing things that people have reported success with, hopefully replicating that success in some number of patients, but maybe also kind of like narrowing down the list of potential suspects as far as what the mechanism is, um, based on what the through lines are between the various treatments that have worked for some people. But
Next question for you, Andrew, and then we got to wrap pretty soon. How's this experienced? I don't know. I mean, it changed your life or your trajectory. I know you're doing molecular biology, but is there a chance you'll end up in molecular neuroscience or something like that?
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's something I've thought about a bit. So like I mentioned earlier, I think my current area of research, has nothing to do with any of this. It's a
Mm.
completely different area of molecular biology, but honestly, this whole experience has been kind of fascinating in a way. Obviously it's extremely unfortunate, and I wish it never happened to me.
Yeah.
And but it is kind of fascinating to think about. It's like wow, what could be going on here?
Hmm.
And I don't have any real uh, strong hypotheses or even educated guesses. Really, I'm very hesitant to really make any statements to that effect. But it is something that I spend a fair amount of time thinking about. I've been reading up on a lot of reading a lot of papers on things that seem like they could be implicated. And I have thought to myself, it's like I sometimes feel almost more motivated to like try and figure this out than I do my own thesis work.
I bet. Yeah.
I mean, because it's more it applies my own life, in a more intimate degree.
And
Um,
maybe to your friends as well. I know a lot of people become quite close knit with the community as well. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and so I don't know. So I haven't really figured out what I want to do exactly post grad school, but if I could do research in this area, if there are opportunities available that would allow me to kind of hopefully tease out exactly what's going on the molecular level, with this condition, yeah, I'd be very interested in that.
Cool. Well, Andrew, anything else that you want to add before we wrap?
No, I think we've pretty much covered everything I have to say. I just want to say thanks again for doing what you're doing. I think the main obstacle towards for like trying to make progress on this topic is just that a lot of people aren't really aware of PSSD, if they are, they're not aware of like how it affects people, what the symptoms are, how it affects people's lives. And I think that increasing out awareness in the way that you're doing will hopefully be instrumental in getting more of the right people interested in the research sphere in particular, and hopefully making some progress towards a cure.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I love talking to you guys. I mean, I feel like I learned so much from it, and As I mentioned earlier on, my motivation with all of this is to try and just in general raise awareness about the consequences of some of these medications, which are often overlooked, so people can make more informed choices. Well, on that note, Andrew, I just want to say thanks again, and please stay in touch over email, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If I have any success with my current treatment strategies, I'll be sure to let you know.
Yeah, please do. Okay. All right. Take care.
All right. Thanks. You too.